Welcome to Poll 2-1. I'm carrying Aristotle. As you remember, Aristotle had argued or claimed that everything is seeking some good. And when he talks about citizenship and the state and basically people, the good that he's looking at is happiness. Now, happiness doesn't mean, and this was already, I mentioned this, didn't I? It doesn't mean the pursuit of bovine pleasures. In terms of the state, the word is eudaimonia, E-U-D-I-M-O-N-I-A, and it's really a state of well-being when something is flourishing in the way that fulfills its capabilities. So he's looking at being a citizen and being a state and what a state should be so that those within it, as far as is possible, because he will look at the various regime types, are able to achieve happiness. So it's important for him that citizens share in the administration of justice and offices so that they can feel part of what they're building. Because you remember with Aristotle, the community must take precedence over the individual. I don't know if I said this to you before, but the word for the private person in ancient Greek is a word we now use idiot, idiotes. So we have taken that word. And there's one bit in Plato, when I read Greek many, many years ago, where he says, I'm not just an idiot, I'm not just a private person who's going around. Well, you think I am, because I should rephrase that. I go around as a private person like an idiot, but really I'm questioning the bigger picture. And that's exactly, of course, what Aristotle is doing. So he recognizes that each state will have its own rules and regulation and hence its own kind of citizenship. He does make an important distinction. Again, it's a kind of distinction that gets blurred over in Plato. And that comes back to an important point I made earlier, that although Plato does look at character, the role of principle, I think, is operating at a far greater degree, so much so that because you're measuring things against the idea, because you recall the idea is divorced from the world. We participate in the idea, but it's something that only the mind's eye can see. Where the way Aristotle thinks of form, of idea, is it's immanent. So it's something intrinsic to what we are. So he wants to make a distinction between the virtue of a citizen and the virtue of a good man. But we did see last week, when he talked about the kind of personality, the kind of character that you would need in order to be serving well in a good kind of state. And that, of course, is a magnanimous man. So each state is looking for its happiness, but that is also to the extent that it can. Again, I think I said this last week. And he does see education as the key to state happiness, but there's different education required for different roles. Again, if we compare that to Plato, we recall that Plato cared about the education of the guardians, and hence of the philosophers, but he doesn't really talk much about the education of the rest. Though, as I did mention, ultimately Plato does settle on the idea, which is picked up by Aristotle, that perhaps the best achievable constitution is one in which there's civic participation. So that would require an education for different roles. Education, of course, was very important to the Greeks, especially the Athenians, and it was simply a fact that when the Greeks got conquered by the Romans, it would usually be, who are now basically an enslaved people, the Greeks would often be the tutors to the Romans. The Romans, for their part, things like theatre and education they thought were very secondary. So they wanted their kids to have a kind of education, and there were, of course, some philosophers, but they were an insignificant social group, really. So they would look to the Greeks, and so much so, for example, in Greece, being an actor or being a playwright was something quite significant. In Rome, again, that was seen as a lesser kind of pursuit, because it was essentially a warrior society, and martial virtues were the ones that were valued so highly. But as Pericles made it very clear in his magnificent speech, which I urge you to read sometime if you want a good insight into Athenian character, in Thucydides' history. It's about the Peloponnesian War, or history of the Peloponnesian Wars. Pericles talks about the importance of freedom in Greek character. And you can see learning and freedom as far as Pericles is concerned. And also that kind of liberality of spirit, which Aristotle had talked about. They're all part and parcel of the same thing. Why did that do that? Was that an earthquake or something? A tremor. So Aristotle also considers a number of political systems. And in fact, we know that he collected well over 200 different kinds of constitutional forms that the Greeks had or had had. And that is quite extraordinary, but it's again typical of the kind of mind Aristotle had. We remember he collected specimens of organisms, of various animals and everything, and that Alexander the Great would send them back to him. Well, he took exactly that same kind of approach to studying human behaviour, human character, and human constitutions. The constitution is the arrangement of the magistrates in the state. That is, who are going to officiate over certain decisions. The way he sees it, the government is everywhere sovereign. The constitution is the government. And the big problem he sees in Greece, obviously there's tyrannies, and he, like Plato, he has no candle to burn for that. He sees democracy and oligarchy as pretty typical, and that was as the most typical, and that was absolutely true. It's very often the case that democracies turn into oligarchies, that certain families start to rule the city. That's quite a common occurrence, and that's not only amongst the Greeks, it's something we find. One of the most important insights he sees as pertaining, or virtues he sees as pertaining to democracy, and I think this is very, very insightful, is that within a democracy, people's activities give them a different take on things. They each come at things from a different point of view. And in many ways, I think that remains one of the most important ideas about any democratic system, because what that tries to enable when it's working well is not a system where you're looking for total conformity, but a system in which you're brokering between different ways of seeing things and the different interests, and you need an input into that so that that becomes articulated. If you don't have any means of expressing a social need, that is a need that belongs to a particular social group where there's a certain degree of consensus or collective opinion about what is to its advantage or even its own perpetuation, that really leaves a very discontented civic body. And that's something that Montesquieu, who we'll look at much later in the semester, that's something that he really picks up on, and is very astute about that. So Aristotle is also trying to balance the power of numbers, the demos, and demos just means the people, with the oligarchy. Oligarchy means the few. And the few is normally the way they are because of the power of their wealth. He does accept or concede, I think I mentioned this last week, that monarchy would be the best if you could find someone who is an absolute genius. And again, it's very interesting how often historically, when there's a real civic crisis, Rome is a perfect example of that. Another closer example to home is Napoleon seizing hold of the French Revolution after it's caused so much blood and so much contestation. But he then says, if the monarch is wise, so basically he doesn't really think that's very likely. And he recognizes that one ruler can easily become a tyrant. So there is a danger with that. The other thing is, this idea of an all-seeing monarch really comes out of a kind of understanding of what the god is. And so that would be a person who is like a god. You might recall me talking about Hesiod, the great Greek poet, who made of Zeus a figure who's able to see everything. Zeus was a sky god, so well positioned to see everything, a kind of all-seeing eye. And immortal as well. Well, the gods definitely are immortal, but it's... Well, I wanted to go into a whole other thing about the Greek because it's so fascinating, but I'll just say that the important thing Hesiod does is try to find moral anchorage for a world in pandemonium. And one of the problems with any polytheistic society is that they tend to have such contestations amongst the gods, and that's all spelt out in great detail in brilliance in Hesiod's Theogony, which is why, by the way, because we're moving to the Christians, and I'll just say about the Jews, one of the things you notice about the Jewish people is that one of the reasons, I think it's very obvious, why they're monotheistic is because they see the problems of having all these discordant forces as divinities. Remember, and I'm kind of leaping ahead, but the case is a little away from Aristotle, but it's a really important point, because we moderns tend to think of the gods in a way as if it's a choice. Whereas I think there's a long history that precedes our arrival at that kind of understanding of what the relationship to God is or the gods is. But in fact, anthropologically, is that someone at the door, is it? No. Anthropologically, what we know is that people recognize very early within human development that there are all these forces of life that simply overwhelm them. And that's what the gods are, because they're trying to find some way to position themselves amongst the gods. You recall that Plato didn't want people to make sacrifices to the gods. But in doing that, Plato has introduced a seismic shift and a complete cutaway with pre-philosophical humanity. That idea is of such vast importance. And in its way, it's very different to the Jews. Because ultimately what that means is the only way you relate to God, the God, is with the mind. But with the Jews, sacrifice is still an intrinsic part of their behaviour. Why? Well, we know one thing, which Plato was at pains to point out, as you recall, that Socrates wanted to illustrate that he was a member of the community by accepting the gods, even though that's precisely what he was criticised for not doing. And we can see the way he accepted it, Socrates accepted, is still participating in public rites and rituals. But ultimately, if you don't have a sacrificial relationship to the god, and your emphasis is upon the mind's eye, intelligence, and Aristotle is as much in keeping with Plato in this way as he is different from the Jews and other polytheistic peoples. If you don't do that, then the more visceral aspects of your humanity tend to be discounted. And so that insight into sacrificial order, which is a term I've used a number of times, that tends to be displaced as you start to look for intellectual order. You're looking for the intellectual order in the cosmos. And Aristotle is very much a part of that, a continuation of that. He also talks about liberty and equality, but we should bear in mind when we think about Aristotle, he's not a modern. One of the other seismic shifts that takes place within modern consciousness is how liberty and equality become the twin pillars of modern political thought, at least in its democratic incarnation. And generally, I'd have to say that the modern political thought tends to gravitate towards some kind of constitution in which liberty and equality play a big part. Now, there are reactions to that, and the biggest, most obvious one is the reaction of fascism. But I'll leave that to one side. So when he's talking about liberty and equality, you can see he's not talking about equality and liberty for women or the slaves. It's all bound up with the role that you have, the position that you have, and what you're trying to achieve. But just to be fair to Aristotle, you recall that he is basically trying to prevent chaos. And he's trying to prevent a city tearing itself apart. And so and we will see that revolution is something that really concerns him. Again, we moderns tend to have a very romantic view of revolution. And in part, that's because so many of our institutions and social practices have come into being through revolutionary transformations. So he sees democracy as requiring freedom and equality, that is, the freedom of those participants within the demos who are going to be magistrates, and they recognize there's a kind of mutual reciprocity of recognition going on, and hence rulership should be rotated so that no one is like the god. In fact, the Greeks, if you study the actual city-states that were democratic in Greece, a common thing that happened was that some person would come to power within the democracy, and after a while they'd be seen as too much of a big head. Even Pericles, who led the Athenians, was in danger of being ostracized, and being ostracized meant you were going to be exiled. So Aristotle, I think, has this very much in his mind when he's talking about this. So it's not wealth, it's not birth, and to some extent it's not even merit. So ultimately what is going on in Aristotle's mind, I think, is that the whole civic body should be meritorious, sufficiently meritorious through their education, so that you can handle this transformation of office. Aristotle really understood the role of envy and how that could lead to class war. And again, he had the examples before him of what had happened. I think I said this last week, where Solon, the first legislator of Athens, one of the things he had tried to do was ensure that no citizen can sell themselves into slavery or bondage. Because if the farm was not doing well and people had been away fighting in wars, which was often the case, then the danger was that you'd have people that should be citizens themselves become slaves. Aristotle also argues for the importance of the rule of law. Again, Plato has done this, and his book, The Laws, is about that. So the idea is that where law rules, everybody, every character is beholden to something bigger than themselves. And I remember talking last week at some length about that. I think the importance of that insight, of recognizing something bigger than you are. He who bids the law rule may be deemed to bid that God and reason alone rule, but he who bids man rule adds an element of the beast. So that's ultimately what law is. Because the cosmos itself, as the way Aristotle sees it, is the creation of intelligence. It's the creation of design. You recall me saying that the idea of design theory is really a classical Greek theory, not a biblical idea. Law is reason unaffected by desire. Now, what you can see here is that what Aristotle is trying to do, he's trying to balance the fact that there's different people with different interests, but at the same time, he is trying for people to recognize that they can't just be driven by their interests. Indeed, I have to say thematically, once again, Aristotle illustrates why he's so important in the history of political ideas. Because as we move on to the moderns, this problem of law and desire is a huge problem. And I'll leap ahead to a thinker that we will look at in some detail, a guy called Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And Rousseau says, so this is a very important figure in the 18th century. Rousseau says that we are free to the extent that we give ourselves a law, which means that we are able to leap beyond our nature, leap beyond our desire, with our intelligence, and with that intelligence then, we're able to live up to it. So there's quite a bit of idealism here, sticking to Aristotle in the way he views the law. And I remember talking last week about this means for Aristotle that law is something you change gradually because it's the rationality of it is something you will only be able to evaluate over time. You see what it does. The form of government he wanted then was one in which the wealthy and the demos, the people, the numbers, would be balanced. And he calls this a polity. So a polity is one in which basically all the citizens participate, but you have to recognize that there has to be a balance. Because quite clearly the very wealthy are always worried that they're going to be taxed too much. And the temptation is for the poor simply want to tax that. This becomes it's a perennial problem of political life. When, for example, a thinker, who I will mention, a very important thinker, but we don't actually study in this course, John Stuart Mill, writes about representative government, and he's writing this in the latter part of the 19th century. He recognizes that there's going to be a real problem as people who don't have a lot of property, primarily the working class, have political representation, although they may pay tax. The danger he sees is that they may actually swamp and soak those with resources, and this will lead to great disgruntlement. So it's a balance. It's a balance of how much equality. Too much, and you create civic strife. Not enough, you create civic strife. And that's, remember the mean, that central idea of Aristotle. He's always trying to get to how to instantiate the mean. So the best state is one in which the true legislator in the statesman needs to know what is best in the abstract, what is the best attainable, and under the circumstance. And I think that's a very neat formulation and typical of the way Aristotle works. The job of political science, and by science, let's not get hung up on modern lab ideas of what science means. He means the study of, the knowledge of, episteme. They will observe how to move from the worst to the better. So there's this incrementalism that's intrinsic to Aristotle. I think you get the picture. It's quite a conservative picture, but it's a conservative picture which really wants to avoid the bloodbath that can come through class contestation. So the job isn't done if you simply identify the best state. You want political moderation and stability. A good city-state is one in which there's a strong middle class. Again, I think that's generally still accurate. Where you do not have a robust middle class, where you don't have sizable numbers in the middle class, and by the middle class, I'm not leaving out the working class, but you want those with sufficient resources that they're happy enough in the world that they're participating in the political world they're participating in. And you need good fellowship. Again, I think he's so right about this. A word I would use, it was a popular word in the Middle Ages, is the word conviviality. And it's a word you don't hear much of today. I hear a lot of political discourse in which equality is being invoked. But I rarely hear the word conviviality being spoken of, if ever. And conviviality means you really enjoy, you love what you're doing and who you're doing it with. In a sense, you're participating in a reality that's sufficiently lovable that you want to maintain it, and you're quite prepared to make sacrifices for its perpetuity. Again, I think that's a really important thing. So fellowship and friendship within rules is intrinsic to what Aristotle thinks is going to be a healthy political order. You might recall me mentioning that this was also an idea that we find in Plato in the laws, and by the way, the laws, in some ways, it's quite a repressive constitution. I won't go too far into that, but one way that Plato thought there could be conviviality was by having drinking parties. And we actually see in one of the dialogues, the Symposium, a perfect example of that, which is a dialogue about a drinking party, where they discuss love. So, for Aristotle, the chief cause of revolution is desire for equality, love of gain, and love of honour. Any one of these can trigger a desire to mobilise other people against the political order you've got. And Aristotle is very worried about revolution because he says ultimately it will tear itself apart. And also bear in mind something that people often forget. I notice this a lot in contemporary. When people are caught up in their own domestic conflicts, they often fail to pay attention to a fact that Aristotle was very aware of, and that is that one's enemies will take advantage of that discord. So you don't just get what you want by striving for more equality or someone wanting, to gain more, or someone wanting to be, or a group wanting to have more privilege. This will affect the relations that occur extrinsic to your own state. So you need to maintain a spirit of law. You should be reluctant to change. Citizens should be treated in a spirit of equality, a strong middle class, not too much inequality. And political office should be should not be an incentive to procure wealth. And I think that is a really interesting thing. If you are interested in contemporary politics, it's very interesting to observe how many people come out of participating in a public life, very, very wealthy people. And for Aristotle, that would be symptomatic of something corrupt, something wrong. To some extent, that also requires that you have a certain number of resources before you get into politics. Okay, we're going to leave the classical world behind. If you had lived in Athens at the time of Socrates, and then you were dropped into the Roman Empire, even around 100 AD, even around the time of the birth of Christ, or certainly if you'd gone to Judea at that time. But then as Christianity started to spread, and not only Christianity, you saw religion starting to spread in a very different kind of way. You would think you would come into a madhouse. And indeed, I would even say, even if you'd been a Roman and you lived in 30 BC, and then, or BC as it's often called now, and then you came and saw what was going on, where the social energy transformation was occurring, you'd be astonished. Because ideas that had really come out of Judea had started to spread and really change people's character and change their ideas about what really counted as important in life. Now, Western civilization, as I've said before, it rests. And the word the word civilization, let me pause on that for a minute. The word civilization suggests a city. It suggests that you've got protection and improvement upon just purely tribal life. An improvement in the sense that you've got a bigger scale division of labour, you've got all sorts of tasks, you've got literacy, and you're able to perpetuate yourself in such a way that you're trying to eternalise yourself. You know, the ancient Egyptians, they write on stone. I think that's a really interesting insight I saw someone say. Because stone, it's like it's impermeable. And that is what civilization wishes to be. Now, when we talk of Western civilization, I don't for a minute want to give you the idea that it's all just of one block. It's shifting, it's changing, and in some ways the word is quite a lazy word. On the other hand, if we don't essentialize it, we see that, well, you can recognize it when you see it, but it's impossible to define with certainty. However, there's lots of periods of time where I think the word doesn't really count for anything, that it doesn't really help us depict what's going on. But nevertheless, the trajectory of what happened in Western Europe over a very protracted period of time was very much bound up with ideas, practices, insights about human experience, and ultimately institutions would be built, which initially, at least, embody this, which are part and parcel of these very contrary positions. I mentioned previously about a God, what it is. It's a hidden power of life. And we're governed by hidden powers of life. And I mentioned that the Jews had recognized all this discordancy amongst polytheistic people, and it probably itself had inherited a polytheistic environment. And it positioned itself against others that were polytheists. And of course, it had been enslaved by the polytheistic Egyptians. So what the Jews did is try to find a way in which all the discordant powers are unified. And that is God. Now, we don't see this early in the Jewish Bible, but eventually that will lead to a dualistic way of thinking, which by the time of Christianity is commonplace, even amongst the Jews. And that is, you've got God and the devil. So you still end up, even going for one, you end up with two. In fact, I don't know how well you know the Bible, but in the book of Job, Satan is kind of like on pretty friendly terms with God. It's not really, doesn't really fulfill the role there. He's a tester. And he says to God, well, do you really think Job's so great? Well, let me go and test him for you, and we'll see how good he is. If you don't know the book of Job, you should read it. It's a great piece of literature in psychology. So religion, that's the other point I wanted to make, and I've said it a few times now. Religion just generally was not something that you pulled out of the rest of life. It just infiltrated life. There were the gods, there was you, there were the rites and rituals. It's with philosophy that you start to have a sort of sense of demarcation where you can ask the question, what is a God? Once you've asked the question, what is a God, you've already put yourself and your intelligence over the very power that initially the community, or the powers that the community had accepted as part and parcel of their social reproduction. So in a sense, philosophy is already on a step to the question of, is there a God or is there not a God? Which Plato doesn't want to ask that question. In fact, in the Laws, again, he gets very angry. Plato believes that the planets are gods because they're eternal and you can see their motions are so regular and orderly and they shine with light. But he says there are some amongst us who think that the planets are nothing but stone and rock. And we've got to stop them, you know. But that, in a sense, again, for the modern, religion just becomes something it becomes a private affair. And it takes a long time, historically. And in fact, I think it really is only a product, in the first instance, of the Western mind, and in the second instance, of the particular configurations of religious life and the reaction to different classes within religious life and the different practices and different narratives about religious life that really the Reformation brings to a head, that you will eventually get, and again coming from the philosophers with deism, eventually get to a move where you get atheism. But initially, religion simply means the bonds. They're the bonds, the lieges, which connect us to these other powers of light. I think I said this, polytheism precedes monotheism. We just can see that everywhere. And as I said, even the original word or an early word that the Jews used for God is Elohim, which is a plural, which suggests it's a plurality of forces within the one. Monotheism brings life into accordance. The Jews had little interest in art, at least not in terms of actually making stuff, but there's nothing, in fact you don't see the word poetry or anything like poetry in the Old Testament or in the Jewish Bible. And when you get to the Christian life, you'll notice that neither poetry nor philosophy are seen as particularly important. But of course, for the Greeks, it's the poets that are the great legislators. Solon himself was a poet as well as a legislator, and I mentioned that people would go to the courts and they would cite poets. Big thing about the Jews, I'll say it again, I've said it, but it's this. Their way of viewing the world is big world, small brains. And God's mind is no more real than God's finger. This is the way we speak of the gods. It's a very anthropomorphic way. It's absolutely contrary to what the philosophers from Xenophanes onwards are doing. The other thing about the Jews was it was a relationship, and sacrifice is part of it. But there's one big difference, at least this is argued by Franz Rosenzweig, R-O-S-E-N-Z-W-E-I-G. I've mentioned him before, a great 20th century Jewish philosopher. He said what was unique about the Jewish people was that relationship between God and humans was such that they were working together on a particular, I'll use this term, project. And he says, God creates, but with his people, we get redemption. But that redemption can only come through revelation. So here you've got the tradition of revelation. That's a very different, and that's what the Bible is. It's a book of revealed truths. It's a chronicle over time, over a huge period of time, polyvocal, which is, of course, why theologians can go forever, because you can just keep going and going and going. And also, if you don't have something like one church, you'll have infinite number of churches. It lends itself to schismatics. It lends itself to schismatics because there's so many different elements in it, so many stories, so many different things going on. And what you weigh and what weight you give to something in what it is, how you're trying to orientate yourself in the world. And that's what it is primarily. The Bible is a book of orientation, which is the chronicle of the relationship between God and his people. And his people, where do his people begin? Every religion carries its foundations with it. And its foundations, and here I'm talking historical and sociological, its foundations are so fundamental to the kind of things that it emphasizes. So what's the great experience of the Jewish people that is so foundational? I've already touched it. Enslavement. Enslavement. What would be the great foundational circumstance of the Christians? Roman conquest, and it's ultimately a kind of civil war of at least of faith going on, of practice within the Jewish community. It's discussed by a small number of Jews at what other Jews and Jewish priests, the Sadducees and the Pharisees are the two main ones, at what they're doing and how they have either been complicit with the Romans in a new kind of oppression, or simply, even worse, completely betrayed the covenant, completely betrayed it. And even again, one of the reasons that the Christians will say, thank you very much, that book that you call the Bible, it is, but it's all leading up to this bit that we're going to add, which the New Testament, as they call it. And of course, for traditional Jews, that's sacrilege. That's just crazy. There's all sorts of things about Christianity that are absolutely in defiance of its tradition. But I said the Jews begin with enslavement. A very interesting thing to do is if you study anything about Egyptian history, you will see the foundations of the Jewish religion are positioned in such a way that the other of Egyptianism, is precisely what this God is not. Something like that. So God is seen as immovable, transformative, changing, all the things that Plato said a God should not be. It's astonishing how, though, if you read theology, how quickly theologians move into a Greek mindset because God is perfect. And I'll start from a principle and start making axioms. But in fact, what we see is that the God of the Bible changes his mind. And you recall me saying in Genesis, he only sees what's happened after he's spoken it into existence. So again, that's indicative of the mind not taking on such a superior role in human endeavour. I actually think that's quite a brilliant insight, because we live in a world which I think is very idiocratic, and a world in which ideas are of such importance that we tend to elevate intelligence as if it was something that simply had a blank sheet out there. So, and suffering is important too. Suffering is really important in the Jewish and the Christian traditions. Again, if you look at what the Greeks are talking about, what the philosophers are talking about, although the suffering of what had taken place in the Peloponnesian Wars clearly gives us a context for why Plato writes the Republic and what Plato wants to do with philosophy and then what Aristotle wants to do, suffering as such tends to be more marginal in the whole thing. And another thing, it's not really about virtue. Righteousness is not the same as virtue. Why? The virtue of the philosopher comes from studying either the idea in its purity in the case of Plato or in the case of Aristotle, studying the way things are in order to make improvement. So what you're really what you're really looking at with the Greeks is virtue. Righteousness is obedience. Righteousness is compliance with the tradition. Righteousness is compliance with the laws that not a person but a God has laid down, or the God has laid down, the only God, the only true God. And so you responding to that and living by that. You can see, again, you see a very different kind of person. We might use the term ideal type, a very modern term that in a way